Great empires can vanish in the space of a single generation. Around the year 1177 before the Common Era, the brilliant civilizations of the Mediterranean world, from the Hittites to the Mycenaeans, fell into ruin. Palaces burned, trade routes went silent, and entire systems of writing were forgotten for centuries. This event, known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, is one of history's most profound mysteries, and at its heart lies the enigmatic force called the Sea Peoples. By the end of this video, you will understand the complex web of climate disaster, economic failure, and human movement that unraveled an age, and you will see why this ancient collapse holds urgent lessons for our interconnected world today. We will examine a desperate plea for help etched into clay that was never sent, and ask whether these shadowy sea raiders were the cause of the catastrophe or its most dramatic symptom. What does it truly take for a civilization to fall? To understand the magnitude of the fall, we must first see the height from which they tumbled. The world of the Late Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated kingdoms, but a remarkably interconnected global system. Think of it as the first true international age, a web of diplomacy, trade, and shared culture stretching from the Nile Delta to the Aegean Sea. At the heart of this network were the great royal palaces, acting as the economic and political hubs of their worlds. In Anatolia, the Hittite capital of Hattusa stood formidable behind cyclopean stone walls, its archives filled with thousands of clay tablets detailing laws, treaties, and rituals. Across the sea, the Mycenaean Greeks ruled from fortified citadels like Mycenae, its famous lion gate a lasting symbol of their power and artistry. And in the south, the new kingdom of Egypt under pharaohs like Ramesses II projected wealth and authority on a colossal scale. These were not backward societies, they were sophisticated states with complex bureaucracies, professional armies, and literate scribble classes. The glue holding this world together was trade. Ships carried Cypriot copper to be alloyed with tin from far-off sources, creating the bronze that gave the age its name. Aegean pottery has been found in Egypt, Egyptian scarabs in Greece, and Baltic amber in Mycenaean tombs. This was a time of vibrant exchange, but perhaps the most vivid window into this interconnected world comes not from artifacts, but from words. In the late 19th century, archaeologists at Amarna in Egypt discovered a royal archive of clay tablets. These are the Amarna letters, a breathtaking collection of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and his fellow kings in Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire. They address each other as brothers, negotiate marriages, exchange lavish gifts, and fret over the correct diplomatic protocols. One letter even complains about the poor quality of gold sent by a fellow monarch, a timeless piece of international bureaucratic friction. This system created immense stability and wealth for those at the center, but that stability came with a hidden cost. The entire edifice was built on a fragile foundation of centralized control, long-distance supply chains, and a delicate balance of power. The palaces controlled everything from food distribution to craft production. This made the system efficient but also brittle. What would happen if the harvests failed, if the tin shipments stopped, or if the delicate web of royal alliances tore? The very interconnectedness that made the Bronze Age world so brilliant also made it uniquely vulnerable to a cascade of failure. The glory of this age makes its sudden disappearance not just a historical footnote, but a profound and haunting mystery. Yet the brilliance of this interconnected world masked a deep and growing fragility. Decades before any foreign fleet was recorded, the system itself began to groan under the weight of multiple, simultaneous crises. The first and perhaps most fundamental stress came from the sky itself. Scientific evidence from ancient tree rings and ice cores tells a stark story. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged period of severe drought and climatic instability. This was not a single bad season, but a shift that lasted for generations. Rainfall patterns changed, temperatures fluctuated, and reliable harvests became a memory. For societies where the palace economy depended on agricultural surplus to feed its workers, soldiers, and scribes, this was a direct threat to survival. Famine would have spread from village to city, weakening populations and eroding the authority of rulers who could no longer guarantee their people's bread. As the climate shifted, so too did the political landscape within the great empires. In Egypt, the long and stable reign of Ramesses II gave way to his son, Merneptah. An aging pharaoh now ruled an empire showing signs of internal strain, with reports of discord and challenges to central authority beginning to surface. Far to the north, the Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival and sometimes ally, faced even graver internal threats. The Hittite heartland in Anatolia was likely hit hard by the same droughts, leading to food shortages. At the same time, the empire was rocked by succession crises and internal power struggles, fracturing the strong, centralized control that had held its diverse territories together. A kingdom fighting for stability at home has far less capacity to project power or maintain its distant trade partnerships. We can see this rising anxiety etched into the very stones of the Mycenaean world. In their final decades, the Greek citadels like Mycenae and Turin underwent frantic programs of fortification. Existing walls were thickened, gateways were redesigned into narrow, easily defended corridors, and secret underground water supplies were engineered. This was not the confident architecture of an expanding power, but the defensive posture of a society that felt besieged, even if the enemy was not yet at the gates. They were fortifying against a threat they sensed but could not yet see. Finally, the great strength of the Bronze Age system, its far-reaching trade networks, revealed a dangerous weakness. Those same ships that carried luxury goods and vital copper also carried unseen passengers. The movement of people and goods across the Mediterranean would have facilitated the spread of illness, with populations lacking immunity facing devastating health challenges. More subtly, the economies had become addicted to long-distance resources. A kingdom could thrive only if tin from afar reached its smiths, and if Egyptian gold could be traded for fine pottery. When those chains snapped, the entire economic model would collapse. These stresses, climate, political instability, fear, and economic dependency, were not separate problems. They fed into one another, creating a feedback loop of decline. A famine-weakened population is more susceptible to illness. A king struggling with succession cannot secure his trade routes. A society spending all its resources on walls is not investing in future prosperity. The superpowers were like great ships taking on water from multiple leaks, each one manageable on its own, but together threatening to pull the entire vessel beneath the waves. They were still afloat, but their resilience was gone. All it would take was one final, overwhelming wave. Into this world of growing strain sailed a new and terrifying force. The first direct testimony we have of the Sea Peoples comes not from a neutral observer, but from the one civilization that managed to withstand their onslaught, ancient Egypt. Our window into this conflict is carved in stone on the walls of the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III, at a site called Medinet Habu. These monumental reliefs are not subtle historical documents. They are triumphant propaganda, designed to proclaim the pharaoh's eternal victory. Yet within their grand, chaotic scenes, we find our most detailed portrait of the enemy. The carvings show a desperate two-front war. On land, Egyptian chariots and infantry clash with a confederation of warriors and their families, who travel in ox-drawn carts, an entire people on the move. At sea, a naval battle rages, showing distinctive Egyptian ships grappling with enemy vessels that look utterly alien, with high prows and sternposts shaped like bird heads. The inscriptions name the attackers, listing tribes with unfamiliar, resonant names: the Peleset, the Jeka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. This is not a single nation, but a coalition of different groups. The artwork provides tantalizing physical clues. We see feathered headdresses, distinctive round shields, and a style of sword that does not match typical Egyptian or Canaanite designs. These details suggest a collection of peoples from diverse origins, perhaps the Aegean, perhaps Anatolia, perhaps elsewhere, now united by circumstance into a migratory fighting force. But we must read these sources with critical eyes. In the Egyptian worldview, the pharaoh was the guardian of Mot, the divine order of the universe. Any threat from outside, any invasion, was framed as chaos, Isfet, attacking the cosmic order. The sea peoples were not just political enemies, they were mythological antagonists in a story where the pharaoh always wins. Their depiction is meant to emphasize their foreignness and their ultimate defeat. To get a fuller picture, we must look back one generation earlier. An earlier pharaoh, Merneptah, son of the great Ramesses II, also recorded a major victory over a coalition of invaders in the late 13th century. His inscription mentions some of the same groups like the Shekelesh, but interestingly, he notes they were allied with Libyan tribes from North Africa. This tells us the phenomenon was not a single event, but a rolling crisis that played out over decades, with shifting alliances between displaced coastal peoples, pastoralists from the deserts, and perhaps desperate refugees from the collapsing northern empires. So what can we truly learn from these Egyptian accounts? They frame the sea peoples as a formidable, multi-ethnic force that challenged the very heart of Egyptian power. They show us a world in violent motion where the old borders and identities were breaking down, but they leave us with more questions than answers. Who were these people really, and where did they come from? To solve that, we must turn from the boasts of the victors to the silent, scorched ruins of the fallen. The boastful carvings on Egyptian walls tell only one side of the story. To understand the true scale of the catastrophe, we must listen to the silent testimony of the earth itself, in a layer of ash and shattered stone found from the coast of Syria to the islands of Greece. Archaeologists call it a destruction layer, a grim marker in the soil that speaks of a single, violent moment frozen in time. And around the year 1177 before the Common Era, this dark band appears in city after city, a chilling archaeological echo of the end of an age. One of the most telling sites is the great port city of Ugarit on the coast of modern-day Syria. Ugarit was a wealthy, cosmopolitan hub, a critical link in the Bronze Age trade network. Its destruction was so swift and complete that the city was never rebuilt. In its ruins, archaeologists found a scene of interrupted life. In a scribbled building, clay tablets lay scattered, some still in the oven waiting to be fired for preservation. This detail is haunting. It means the attack came without warning, in the midst of a regular administrative task. The last written words from Ugarit include a desperate tablet sent to the king of a nearby island, pleading for help because the enemy's ships had already been sighted. The reply found in the ruins suggests no help would come. The island was dealing with its own crisis. This is the collapse in microcosm, a cry for help into a void where all allies are similarly besieged. Far to the north, in the heart of the Hittite Empire, the story is just as stark. The capital, Hattusa, was not some minor outpost. It was a monumental fortress city with walls 26 feet thick. Yet it too was consumed by a great fire and abandoned. The palace and temples were burned, and the city's gates were left broken. Here, however, the evidence complicates a simple story of foreign invasion. There are few signs of a prolonged siege or a climactic battle within the walls. This has led some scholars to suggest the possibility of internal rebellion, or that the city was already weakened and emptied by famine before being put to the torch, perhaps by its own desperate citizens or by a small, opportunistic force. Across the Aegean Sea, the pattern repeats. The mighty citadels of the Mycenaean Greeks, places like Pylos, Tiryns, and even legendary Mycenae itself, all show layers of intense burning around this same pivotal time. At some sites, there is evidence of violent conflict, with arrowheads found embedded in walls and skeletons showing signs of trauma. But again, the picture is not uniform. In certain places, the destruction seems aligned with seismic activity. The region is prone to earthquakes, which could have toppled palaces and ignited fires that then sparked social chaos. The key takeaway from all this digging is not a single, neat answer. It is the terrifying scale and near synchronicity of the devastation. From the Levant to Anatolia to Greece, the brilliant urban centers of the age, the very nodes of that interconnected world, went dark within a span of roughly 50 years. This widespread physical evidence forces us to think differently. A single invading horde, no matter how fierce, could not have orchestrated such perfectly timed destruction across thousands of miles of varied terrain. The destruction layers are not the signature of one villain, but the symptom of a total system failure. They represent the moment when all those simmering stresses, the droughts, the famines, the political fractures, and the ruptured trade routes, reached a critical breaking point. A major city might have been finished off by a raid from the sea, but it was likely already a hollow shell, its granaries empty and its social order crumbling from within. The archaeology shows us a world where the foundations gave way, and the entire complex structure came crashing down in a storm of fire, conflict, and flight. So if the Sea Peoples were not a lone, apocalyptic cause, what role did they actually play in this unraveling? The devastation was not a single event, but a rolling wave of catastrophe that broke differently upon each shore. To grasp the totality of the collapse, we must follow its grim path from one great power to the next, witnessing how the same storm could sink some civilizations entirely while leaving others battered and forever changed. First, the Hittite Empire, a military and diplomatic giant that had rivaled Egypt for centuries. Its fate was the most absolute. The great capital of Hattusa, with its immense walls and vast archives, was consumed by fire and then, most tellingly, abandoned. The Hittites did not simply relocate their capital, their entire imperial structure, their language, and their complex state religion vanished from history. The land of Hatti became a landscape of forgotten ruins, its people seemingly absorbed into new, smaller communities. This was not a defeat. It was a complete erasure of a superpower from the political map. Across the Aegean Sea, the brilliant world of the Mycenaean Greeks met a similar, chilling end. Their fortified palace complexes, centers of administration and wealth, were burned and left in ruins. The consequences here were profound and cultural. With the palaces gone, the need for their intricate record-keeping vanished. The script they used, Linear B, was forgotten, plunging Greece into a centuries-long period where writing disappeared entirely. Population levels fell dramatically, trade with the wider Mediterranean ceased, and the skill to build monumental stone architecture was lost. The heroic age described by Homer was not the height of Mycenaean power, but a later, poetic memory of its ghost. On the coast of Syria, the vibrant mercantile city of Ugarit serves as a stark symbol of the collapse's finality. As a critical trading hub, it was the epitome of Bronze Age connectivity. Yet its destruction was so thorough, and the world around it so broken, that it was never rebuilt. The city's ashes were left undisturbed for centuries, a time capsule of sudden, violent termination. Its fate tells us that when the entire network fails, even the most vital node cannot survive alone. But the wave did not leave only obliteration in its wake. On the island of Cyprus, a more complex story unfolded. Major centers like Inkomi and Kishon were indeed damaged, but they were not abandoned. Instead, they were rebuilt, and their material culture shows a fascinating shift. New styles of pottery, architecture, and weaponry appear, blending local traditions with elements that archaeologists link to some of the groups named among the Sea Peoples. Here, collapse was not an end, but a violent catalyst for a new cultural synthesis, a rebirth under a different identity. And what of Egypt, the civilization whose records first named the threat? Egypt survived, but it was profoundly diminished. The pharaohs of the 20th dynasty, culminating in Ramesses III, successfully repelled the direct attacks, but at a tremendous cost. The empire lost its valuable territories in Canaan, cutting off a major source of tribute and trade. The central government's authority weakened, leading to economic decline, official corruption, and the rise of local power. The age of pyramid builders and vast conquests was over, giving way to a more insular, struggling Egypt. This catalogue of fates, from utter extinction to survival in a shrunken form, reveals the collapse's true nature. It was not a single invading army, but a systemic failure that created a power vacuum across the entire region. Some civilizations were consumed by the vacuum, others were squeezed into new shapes by it. Out of that emptiness, a new world would have to be forged, but first, we must ask who or what actually filled that void in the aftermath. This leaves us with a crucial question, one that has shaped our understanding of the collapse for over a century. Were the Sea Peoples a single, terrifying cause, or were they something else entirely? The traditional image is compelling, a unified barbarian horde sweeping down from the north to destroy civilization. But modern archaeology and a closer reading of the evidence paint a far more complex and ultimately more human picture. The idea of a monolithic invader is beginning to crumble. Think about the logistics for a moment. How could a single, coherent mass of people with families and ox carts coordinate simultaneous naval and land campaigns across the entire eastern Mediterranean, from Anatolia to Egypt? The scale and geography make it nearly impossible. The Egyptian records themselves provide the first clue against this simple story. They list multiple names: the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, each with distinct styles of dress and weaponry in the carvings. This suggests not one nation on the march, but a coalition of different groups, perhaps with different origins and different motives. So if they were not a unified army, who were they? A more likely explanation is that the Sea Peoples were a symptom of the collapse, not its root cause. They were the human turbulence within the power vacuum. Imagine the chain of events. As drought and famine hit Anatolia, entire communities of farmers and herders would have been displaced. As the Hittite central authority fractured, its coastal subjects and mercenary soldiers would have found themselves without a patron, turning to piracy or migration to survive. As trade routes collapsed, skilled sailors and shipbuilders lost their livelihoods. These were not necessarily foreign invaders in the classic sense. They could very well have been people from the fringes of the very empires that were falling. A Mycenaean sailor, a Hittite coastal trader, a displaced farmer from Cyprus, all thrown together by circumstance into a desperate, mobile alliance. Their confederation was likely one of convenience, a temporary pact for mutual survival in a world that was coming apart at the seams. This reframing is supported by what happened after the waves of destruction. Some groups did not simply vanish. The Peleset, for instance, are widely identified with the Philistines of the Bible. Archaeological evidence shows that after their clashes with Egypt, they settled on the southern coast of Canaan. They established their own powerful city-states like Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. They adopted local Canaanite pottery styles and eventually local languages, but maintained distinct cultural elements like their consumption of pork and their particular style of pottery decoration for centuries. This is not the behavior of a destructive horde intent only on plunder. It is the behavior of a people seeking a new home after their old world had disappeared. They moved into the empty spaces left by the collapsed system and built something new, Seeing the Sea Peoples in this light changes the entire narrative of the Bronze Age collapse. It moves us away from a simple story of villains and victims and towards a tragic understanding of systemic failure. The real catastrophe was the shattering of a fragile international order under the weight of climate change, resource scarcity, and internal strain. The Sea Peoples were a manifestation of that chaos, a diverse collection of refugees, opportunists, and warriors surfing on the wave of collapse, sometimes accelerating it, but not creating it from nothing. They filled the vacuum, and in doing so, they became the most visible face of the disaster. But to truly solve the mystery of their identity, we must look beyond Egyptian accounts and ask where archaeology suggests they began their journey. Their terrifying effectiveness came from the sea. To grasp how these groups could threaten even mighty Egypt, we must look closely at their ships and their strategy, for their power was a maritime one. The carvings at Medinet Habu provide our only detailed visual evidence, and the vessels they show are strikingly different from anything else in the contemporary Mediterranean. Egyptian warships had high, raised fighting platforms at the bow and stern, giving their archers and spearmen an elevated position. The ships of the Sea Peoples, by contrast, are depicted with sleek, clean lines. They feature high, vertical prows and sterns, often decorated with what looks like a bird's head, and they are clearly powered by both a single square sail and banks of oars. Crucially, they lack those elevated platforms. This design tells a story. These were not ships built for a stand-up, fleet-against-fleet battle in open water. They were built for speed, for agility, and for carrying capacity. They were raiders designed to slash in quickly toward a beach or an undefended port town, disgorge a fighting force, and then retreat back into the waves before a proper defense could be organized. Their tactics likely exploited the very interconnectedness they sought to destroy. The Bronze Age superpowers depended on a constant flow of goods along predictable coastal routes. A handful of these fast ships, appearing without warning, could cripple a port, capture a grain ship, and vanish, sowing paralyzing fear along a vast coastline. The economic damage from such disruption would have been immense, choking the vital trade that sustained palaces and armies far inland. This maritime mystery deepens with a startling absence from the archaeological record. For all their feared presence, we have found almost no shipwrecks that can be definitively identified as belonging to the Sea Peoples. A few candidates exist, like the Cape Gelidonia wreck off the coast of Turkey, which carried a mixed cargo of raw metal and tools, suggesting an itinerant trader or perhaps a smith's floating workshop. But a sunken warship or a dedicated troop transport from this specific period remains elusive. This absence is itself a clue. It suggests their campaigns were not massive, organized naval invasions with hundreds of identical vessels, but rather smaller, more fluid operations by numerous independent bands. Their ships, while effective, may not have been ocean-going galleys built for the deep sea, but rather sophisticated versions of coastal craft. So where did this naval capability come from? Two compelling possibilities emerge. The first is that some of these groups were already master seafarers from the Western Mediterranean, perhaps from Sardinia or Sicily, whose names, Shekelesh and Sherden, seem to echo those islands. The second, and perhaps more likely, scenario is that they were a composite force that included many coastal peoples from the collapsing Aegean and Anatolian worlds. Think of the skilled sailors from the ruined ports of Mycenaean Greece or the shipbuilders from the Levantine coast, their old livelihoods gone. For these people, the sea was not a barrier but a highway and a refuge. Their naval prowess was not an ancient inheritance from a distant homeland, but a desperate skill set honed by necessity in a dissolving world. They took to the waves not as conquerors from a foreign shore, but as survivors from a collapsing system, turning their intimate knowledge of the coasts into a new, devastating form of power. Their strength was born from the very chaos they came to represent. But if their naval power was born of necessity, Where did the people themselves begin their journey? One of the most compelling theories suggests we need not look for a distant, mythical homeland. The origins of several key groups may lie much closer to the centers of power within the very empires that were crumbling. This is the Anatolian connection, a hypothesis that ties the Sea Peoples directly to the political landscape they supposedly destroyed. The clues are often linguistic, echoes of names preserved across different languages and centuries. Take the Denyen, one of the tribes named by the Egyptians. Their name bears a striking resemblance to the Danaoi, a term used by the poet Homer centuries later to refer to the Greeks themselves. Could the Denyen have been Mycenaean Greeks, perhaps from the western coast of Anatolia, who took to the sea as their world fell apart? Similarly, the Jeka might connect to the Teucrians, a people associated with the Troad, the region around ancient Troy. And the Shekelesh, their name seems to whisper of Sicily. These are not solid identifications, but tantalizing hints of a diaspora, of populations on the move from known places into the chaotic unknown of the collapse. The theory gains strength when we consider the historical context of Anatolia in the late 13th century. The Hittite Empire was not a monolithic bloc. It was a patchwork of core territories and semi-independent vassal states along its coast. These coastal regions, like Arzawa and Lucca, were populated by skilled seafarers and fierce warriors who sometimes served as mercenaries or uneasy allies to the Hittite king. When the Hittite heartland was crippled by drought and internal strife, the central authority in Hattusa evaporated. The glue holding this complex system together simply dissolved. So what happened to those coastal communities and their warriors? They were suddenly adrift. The patronage and protection of the great king were gone. The trade routes that sustained their ports were failing. They faced the same environmental hardships as everyone else. In this scenario, these groups did not invade from some external realm. They were pushed into motion from within the collapsing system. They transformed from frontier communities and maritime subjects into roving bands out of sheer survival. The Lucca, for instance, are mentioned in Hittite texts as a sometimes troublesome coastal people, and they also appear in Egyptian records as part of the Sea Peoples coalition. This paints a picture of a known entity, a regional power, adapting to a new and desperate reality. This internal theory profoundly reshapes the narrative. It reduces the need for a mysterious external catalyst. Instead, the Sea Peoples become a symptom of the collapse that reached a critical mass. They were the human manifestation of the power vacuum, a collection of displaced peoples, unemployed soldiers, and stranded maritime communities who coalesced into a formidable migratory force. They were not the lightning bolt that struck the stable palace. They were the flood that rose as the palace's foundations gave way. Their story is less about a barbarian horde and more about the tragic unraveling of a world where the very people who once lived on its fringes became the agents of its final dissolution. This perspective makes the Bronze Age collapse not a simple story of us versus them, but a complex human tragedy of systemic failure, where the lines between victim, perpetrator, and survivor become heartbreakingly blurred. The fall of the Mycenaean citadels offers a haunting and intimate perspective on this chaos, as their own world of warrior kings and grand palaces collapsed into fire and silence. Where did all those people go? The possibility is both logical and unsettling, that some of the very groups labeled as Sea Peoples were, in fact, Mycenaean Greeks caught in a desperate spiral of their own. Linguistic echoes across the centuries offer a faint but compelling trail. The Denyen, named in Egyptian inscriptions, bear a name remarkably similar to the Danaoi, a term Homer would later use for the Greeks in his epics. Another group, the Ekwesh, mentioned by Pharaoh Merneptah, might connect to the Achaeans, another Homeric name for the Greeks. These are not perfect matches, but they are whispers of identity preserved in the records of their enemies. This theory moves beyond names and into the realm of human behavior. Imagine the scene in the final days of a place like Pylos or Mycenae. The palace has burned. The central authority that organized the army and distributed bronze is gone. What becomes of the professional warrior class, the men trained to fight from chariots and skilled in naval warfare? Their entire social and economic purpose has vanished overnight. With their homes in ruins and their way of life erased, the sea would have presented the only open road. These men still possessed their weapons, their ships, and their martial expertise. In such a vacuum, the line between a displaced noble seeking a new kingdom and a desperate raider seeking survival becomes very thin indeed. Archaeology adds a tangible layer to this idea. In places like Cyprus and along the coast of the Levant, archaeologists have found pottery from this very period made in the distinct style of the Mycenaeans. This is not the fine pottery of earlier trade, but often simpler, functional ware. Its presence suggests not just trade, but the movement of people, perhaps entire communities, bringing their household goods with them as they sought new shores. These finds create a picture of migration, of groups carrying their culture with them as they navigated the turbulent aftermath. Homer's great poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, though written down centuries later, preserve a deep cultural memory of this era. They are filled with stories of Greek heroes sailing east across the Aegean, to the coasts of Anatolia and beyond, on great expeditions. While these epics mythologize events like the Trojan War, they may reflect a distorted memory of a time when armed bands from the Greek world did indeed sail east, not as unified empires, but as leaderless fleets of the uprooted. They were not invading a stable world, but entering a zone of shared collapse. This perspective forces a profound shift in how we view the collapse. It blurs the comfortable categories of victim and aggressor. A Mycenaean warrior sailing from a scorched homeland was undoubtedly a victim of a systemic disaster. But if he then used his skills to attack a weakened city on the coast of Canaan to secure food and land for his people, he became, in the eyes of those he attacked, a terrifying aggressor. This was not a war between civilizations, but a tragic, chaotic chain reaction. Refugees from one collapsing region became the raiders of another, who in turn created more refugees, in a devastating feedback loop of displacement and violence. The Sea Peoples, in this light, were not a foreign infection, but a symptom of the fever raging through the entire body of the late Bronze Age world. But the search for origins does not stop at the Aegean coast. Another compelling thread in this mystery leads us westward, across the open sea to the rugged islands of the central Mediterranean. Here, the names recorded by the Egyptians seem to echo the geography of a distant shore. The Sherden warriors, famously depicted on Egyptian reliefs wearing distinctive horned helmets, bear a name that sounds remarkably like Sardinia. Centuries after the collapse, the Nuragic culture of that island produced small bronze figurines of warriors, and some of these figures are shown wearing helmets crowned with curved horns, a striking visual parallel to those ancient carvings at Medinet Habu. Another group, the Shekelesh, naturally brings Sicily to mind, while the Teresh might connect to the Tyrrhenian Sea or even the ancestors of the later Etruscans in Italy. If these linguistic links hold weight, they suggest a story far grander in scale, a vast migration or raiding circuit that stretched from the western Mediterranean all the way to the gates of Egypt. This hypothesis forces us to reconsider the map of the ancient world. It was not just a network linking Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant, but a system whose connections may have reached much farther than we once thought. The idea of warriors sailing from Sardinia to raid the Nile Delta seems astonishing, but it speaks to a level of maritime knowledge and ambition that reshapes our understanding of Bronze Age mobility. So what could have compelled peoples from these western islands to embark on such a perilous, long-distance journey? The drivers were likely a combination of push and pull. Local pressures, such as population growth or competition for resources on their home islands, may have pushed groups to seek new opportunities. At the same time, the legendary wealth of the Eastern civilizations, the gold of Egypt and the copper of Cyprus, would have exerted a powerful pull. These Western groups may have begun as traders or mercenaries, drawn into the lucrative Eastern networks, only to find themselves caught in the escalating chaos as that system failed. When crisis hit the core, these peripheral players, already familiar with the sea routes, could have transitioned from participants to predators, exploiting the vulnerability of the crumbling states. This Western origin story paints a breathtaking picture of an interconnected ancient world, one where a disturbance in one region could send shockwaves across thousands of miles of ocean. It suggests the late Bronze Age collapse was not a regional event, but a systemic failure that drew in actors from its farthest edges. The vacuum created by the falling empires did not just suck in their immediate neighbors, it pulled in ambitious groups from the distant periphery, all converging on the dissolving center of power and wealth. Whether they came from Sardinia, Sicily, or the coasts of Anatolia, these diverse peoples became unified under a single, terrifying label in the eyes of those trying desperately to hold the old world together. They were the human whirlwind at the heart of the storm, and their convergence marked the point of no return. While theories of human movement offer powerful explanations, they overlook the silent, overarching actor in this ancient drama, the climate itself. The world of the late Bronze Age did not unravel in a vacuum of perfect weather. It fractured under a sky that had turned hostile. Modern science now allows us to read the story written not in clay or stone, but in the very earth and ice. Paleoclimatologists, by studying ancient lake sediments, mineral deposits in caves, and fossilized pollen, have reconstructed a startling picture. In the decades surrounding the year 1200 before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged period of severe aridification, a mega-drought that may have lasted for generations. This was not a few bad seasons, but a fundamental shift in the climate system that sustained civilization. The consequences of such a shift are almost too vast to comprehend at a human scale. In Anatolia, the breadbasket of the Hittite Empire, reliable rainfall would have become a memory. Fields that once produced abundant harvests failed season after season. The intricate palace economies were built on a foundation of agricultural surplus, grain stored in vast palace granaries to feed the army, the scribes, the artisans, and the laborers. When the harvests vanished, that surplus evaporated. A state cannot pay its soldiers in promises, and a hungry army is an army that dissolves or turns on its own leaders. Famine would have spread like a shadow across the land, weakening populations, making them susceptible to illness, and eroding the sacred contract between a king and his people. A ruler who could not provide bread was a ruler whose divine mandate was in peril. This environmental pressure also set entire populations in motion. Imagine a farming community in the Hittite hinterlands, watching their wells dry up and their livestock perish. Their only choice for survival is to move, to seek out land that still holds water. These were not organized armies seeking conquest, but waves of desperate climate refugees. They would have pressed against the borders of still-functioning states, straining resources and sparking conflict with settled populations who were themselves on the edge. The Great Walls of Mycenaean or Hattusa were not just defenses against foreign fleets, they were barriers against this rising tide of human desperation. In this light, climate change emerges not as a dramatic villain, but as the great destabilizer. It did not single-handedly topple palaces, but it systematically removed their resilience. A kingdom weakened by years of drought and famine is a brittle kingdom. Its social fabric is frayed, its economy is crippled, and its capacity to respond to any new crisis, whether a raid from the sea or an earthquake, is almost zero. The mega-drought created a world of profound vulnerability. It turned the interconnected networks from a source of strength into a chain of fragility. where the failure of one harvest could ripple into a political collapse 1,000 miles away. So, when we finally see the fleets on the horizon and the fires in the cities, we are witnessing the climax of a story that began with a changing sky. The drought was the essential background condition, the catalyst that made the unthinkable collapse not only possible, but in many ways inevitable. It reminds us that the mightiest human empires are always in a delicate negotiation with the natural world, a lesson that echoes with unmistakable urgency today. That intricate web of trade was the civilization's lifeblood, and when it was cut, the patient began to bleed out. The Bronze Age global economy functioned like a delicate, high-stakes relay race. Imagine a single bronze sword. The copper might be mined in Cyprus, shipped across the sea, while the tin needed to harden it traveled an even more astonishing route, likely from as far away as modern Afghanistan, overland through Anatolia and then onto ships. These raw materials would converge in a palace workshop, be alloyed by a specialized smith, and distributed to a warrior whose loyalty was secured by such a gift. This entire process, from mine to militiaman, depended on a chain of trust, stable routes, and secure shipping lanes that stretched for thousands of miles. When the Mega-Drought struck Anatolia, it didn't just wither crops, it severed this continental lifeline. Overland routes became impassable due to hardship and conflict, choking off the vital flow of tin. Suddenly, the recipe for bronze itself was impossible to complete. At the same time, piracy and insecurity made the sea lanes a terrifying gamble. The fast ships of raiders, whether displaced sailors or opportunistic bands, turned the Mediterranean highways into alleys of ambush. A merchant vessel carrying ingots of Cypriot copper was no longer just a cargo ship, it was a floating treasure chest, and the risk of launching it became too great. One by one, the ships stopped sailing. The ports fell silent, and with that silence came an economic shockwave that reached every throne room. The palace economies were not built for self-sufficiency, they were built for prestige and redistribution. Kings maintained their power through a system of gift-exchange diplomacy, sending lavish presents of gold, ivory, and fine textiles to their royal brothers in other lands to secure alliances. These luxury goods were not trivial, they were the currency of international politics. Furthermore, the palace supported specialized artisans, jewelers, chariot makers, and fresco painters, whose skills relied entirely on imported materials. When the trade networks collapsed, the kings ran out of gifts. They ran out of bronze to equip their armies. They ran out of the very symbols that demonstrated their right to rule. The glue of the international system, that brotherhood of kings we saw in the Amarna letters, dissolved into a desperate scramble for dwindling resources. The consequence was a stark and rapid localization. With long-distance trade gone, economies that had been globally connected for centuries were forced to contract. Regions reverted to subsistence, focusing only on what could be grown or made locally. The intricate knowledge of alloying metals, of crafting complex jewelry, of writing administrative tablets became irrelevant skills in a world now concerned solely with basic survival. This economic domino effect shows us the true fragility of that age. The failure of agriculture, a primary sector, triggered the failure of trade, a secondary sector, which in turn made the entire political and social superstructure unsustainable. By the time the fleets historically known as the Sea Peoples appeared on the horizon, the economic body of the Bronze Age world was already in catastrophic failure. Their raids were not the cause of death, but a violent attack on a patient already in its final throes, accelerating the end and leaving no doubt about the finality of the collapse. Yet the walls that burned may have been torched by hands that once built them. Could the true end have come not from a foreign fleet, but from a rebellion of the forgotten? The glittering wealth of the Bronze Age palaces, with their storerooms of grain and workshops of gold, represented an immense concentration of power. For the farmers, herders, and laborers whose toil filled those storerooms, This system offered protection and stability, but it also created deep social inequalities. The king was the shepherd, his people the flock, a relationship sacred but fragile. When the droughts came and the granaries began to empty, that sacred contract faced its ultimate test. A ruler who could no longer provide security from famine or protection from raiders was a ruler whose divine mandate evaporated. The shepherd had failed the flock, and the flock, in its desperation, may have turned on the shepherd. At several key sites, the pattern of destruction hints at internal violence rather than a clean military conquest. In some ruins, there is a notable absence of weapons in the streets or signs of a last stand at the gates. Instead, the fiercest fires seem concentrated in the palace and temple complexes, the very symbols of elite power. This suggests a targeting of authority, a purging of the ruling class by those who lived under its rule. It is the archaeology of revolt, not invasion. In this light, the chaos attributed to the Sea Peoples takes on a new dimension. The appearance of these external raiders, sowing panic and diverting what remained of the royal armies, could have been the perfect catalyst for a long-simmering internal explosion. For a local peasantry pushed to the brink by hunger and taxation, the sight of the king's forces scrambling to defend the coast might have presented a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The gates to the palace were left unguarded, the symbols of oppression were vulnerable. Similarly, rival factions within the elite itself, lesser nobles or military commanders sidelined by the central court, could have seized the moment to stage a coup, using the external crisis as cover to settle old scores and seize power for themselves. This perspective transforms the collapse from a simple story of us versus them into a far more complex human tragedy. It suggests the palatial system did not just fall, it was rejected. The very people it was designed to govern may have become the agents of its final destruction, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to survive a system that could no longer sustain them. The enemy was not always at the gates, sometimes it was within the walls, born from the failures of the world it inhabited. This adds a profound layer of moral complexity to the catastrophe, reminding us that civilizations are not merely destroyed, they can also unravel from the inside out when the bond between the powerful and the people breaks. Their story did not end with the battle or the failed invasion. For one group among the Confederation, the path forward led not to oblivion, but to a new home and a lasting legacy. The Peleset, named on the walls of Medinet Habu, are the key to this transformation. After their clashes with the armies of Ramesses III, they did not vanish into the sea from which they came. Instead, they settled on the southern coast of Canaan, a land that would become their own for centuries. Here, they established a powerful league of 5 cities, known as the Pentapolis: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. This settlement offers us a rare and complete archaeological case study, showing how a people labeled as agents of chaos became builders of a new order. When archaeologists began excavating these Philistine cities, they uncovered a cultural signature that was strikingly foreign to the local Canaanite landscape. In the earliest layers, they found a distinctive type of pottery known to scholars as Mycenaean II IC1b. This was not imported luxury ware, but everyday household pottery, bowls and jugs and cooking pots, made locally but in a style that echoed the Aegean world of the fallen Mycenaeans. The designs were different, the clay was prepared differently, and the shapes were those used for generations in Greek lands. This was a technology and an aesthetic brought by people who carried their cultural memory in their hands. Even more telling were the dietary habits preserved in ancient garbage heaps. The bones found in early Philistine settlements show a clear preference for pork, a meat largely avoided by their Canaanite and Israelite neighbors. This was more than a taste, it was a cultural marker, a persistent tradition that set them apart. Their architecture, too, showed innovation with hearths and plastered floors uncommon in the region. For a few generations, these communities maintained a strong, separate identity, a little piece of the Aegean world transplanted onto the coast of Canaan. But then a fascinating process of blending began. Over the course of a century or two, the stark foreignness of their material culture started to soften. Their pottery began to incorporate local Canaanite shapes and decorative styles, creating a unique hybrid. They adopted the local language, eventually losing their own, and began to worship gods that merged their own traditions with Canaanite deities like Dagon. They became, in essence, Canaanites, but with a distinct Philistine flavor that persisted. This journey from raider to settler reframes the entire narrative of the Sea Peoples. It shows that for some, the Great Migrations were not about mindless destruction, but about a desperate search for stability. They were not an unstoppable wave intent on wiping the slate clean. They were people in need of a slate of their own. After the trauma of displacement and the violence of the collapse, they sought what all people seek: land to farm, walls to shelter behind, and a future for their children. Their successful settlement provides a direct and tangible link between the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse and the new political map of the Iron Age. The Philistines became one of the major powers of the region, their rivalry with the emerging kingdoms of Israel etched into biblical history. In their transformation, we see the end of one age and the difficult, pragmatic birth of another. The collapse did more than burn cities, it erased the very words of an age. Across the shattered landscape, the tools of memory and power, the written scripts, vanished into silence. In the Hittite heartland, the complex cuneiform pressed into clay tablets, which recorded laws, treaties, and royal decrees, was simply abandoned. The scribble schools that taught this intricate system closed forever, and the language of the Hittite kings became a dead tongue, its meaning lost for over 3,000 years. At Ugarit, a similar fate befell its own unique cuneiform alphabet, a script perfectly suited for recording the city's vibrant trade and literature. The tablets that survived did so only by accident, baked hard in the fires that destroyed the archives, waiting millennia for someone to understand them again. But perhaps the most profound linguistic blackout occurred in Greece. There, the Mycenaean palaces used a script called Linear B, a syllabary of about 90 signs employed exclusively for administrative records, inventories of chariot wheels, counts of livestock, and lists of religious offerings. When the palaces burned, the need for these inventories disappeared. The specialized class of scribes who knew the script died out or dispersed, and within a generation or two, the knowledge of how to read or write those symbols was utterly forgotten. Greece entered a period often called a Dark Age, not because life ceased, but because the light of written history was extinguished. For centuries, the glorious past of the Mycenaean world lived on only in garbled oral tales, the seeds of what would become the Homeric epics, told by people who could no longer read the records of the very kings they sang about. This loss represents something far deeper than a change in fashion. It signifies a catastrophic drop in organizational complexity. Writing was the technology that enabled the palace economy, that allowed a central authority to manage resources across great distances and over time. Its disappearance meant societies could no longer coordinate on that scale. They shrank back to a more local, oral form of governance. The link to the past was severed, making the Bronze Age civilizations truly lost, their stories locked away in indecipherable codes. Yet the story of writing during the collapse is not one of universal extinction. In two key regions, the flame of literacy was sheltered and even advanced. In Mesopotamia, the ancient tradition of cuneiform, though simplified, continued uninterrupted under the rising powers of Assyria and Babylon. More revolutionary developments occurred in the Levant. There, in the shadow of the chaos, Canaanite scribes were refining a breakthrough, the alphabet. By distilling the hundreds of signs used in cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs down to a manageable set of 22 symbols representing consonants, they created a writing system of astonishing efficiency and accessibility. This was the ancestor of the Phoenician script, which would later spread across the Mediterranean, and of the Hebrew script used to record ancient texts. This contrast is illuminating. The same crisis that wiped out literacy in one region spurred its evolution in another. The alphabetic scripts survived and thrived precisely because they were simpler, more adaptable, and less tied to the doomed palace bureaucracies. The era of the Sea Peoples, therefore, represents a stark rupture in human memory. It was a reset button on cultural development, a several-century-long gap where the accumulated records of empires turned to dust and mystery. The great achievements of the Bronze Age, its treaties, its poetry, its very history, would have to be painstakingly rediscovered by archaeologists and linguists in the modern age, pieced together from broken clay and scattered stones. We are only now hearing their voices again after a silence of 3,000 years. The silence that followed the Bronze Age was not a historical accident, but perhaps an inevitable recalibration. To grasp the full meaning of this ancient unraveling, we can place it beside other great collapses that echo through time, like the fall of the classic Maya cities or the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire. Though separated by continents and centuries, these disasters whisper similar warnings. In the Maya heartland, magnificent city-states like Tikal and Palenque were abandoned to the jungle after centuries of glory. Research points to a devastating combination of prolonged drought, intense warfare between rival kings, and the overexploitation of their fragile tropical environment. The monumental plazas and temples, symbols of royal and divine power, became unsustainable burdens. Similarly, the Roman Empire did not fall in a day, but frayed over generations, buckling under its own immense size, political corruption, economic strain, and the pressure of migrating groups along its vast frontiers. In each case, we see a familiar constellation of crises: environmental stress pushing against social rigidity, overextension straining resources, and external pressures finding cracks in a weakened structure. These parallels point toward a profound insight about how civilizations function and why they sometimes cease to. The historian Joseph Tainter offers a compelling framework with his theory of diminishing returns on complexity. Imagine a society as a problem-solving machine, initially adding layers of organization like a centralized government, a professional army, or a scribbled bureaucracy, yields great benefits, stability, wealth, and cultural flowering. This was the brilliant achievement of the Bronze Age palaces, but over time, maintaining that ever more complex system requires more and more energy in the form of taxes, resources, and social control. The returns on that investment begin to diminish. The system becomes top-heavy, brittle, and inefficient. When a major shock arrives, whether a 100-year drought or a disruption of vital trade, the complex society lacks the resilience to adapt. It cannot downsize its ambitions or simplify its structure quickly enough. The result is not a mere setback, but a catastrophic simplification. Viewed through this lens, the late Bronze Age collapse appears less like a murder mystery and more like a systemic failure. The great palaces, with their intricate administrations and far-flung dependencies, had become too complex to sustain under the mounting pressures. The investment in colossal walls, vast granaries, and international diplomacy was no longer paying off as harvests failed and allies vanished. The collapse, then, was a brutal but effective simplification. The centralized, globalized system shattered, and in its place arose smaller, more localized, and ultimately more sustainable communities. The loss was immense: art, writing, monumental architecture, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. But this reversion to a less complex order created the conditions for a different kind of future. Out of the simplified villages of the Greek Dark Age would eventually emerge the city-states of classical Greece. The Phoenician cities, leveraging their simplified alphabet, would become the new masters of Mediterranean trade. The collapse cleared the ground painfully for new seeds to grow. This comparative view removes the event from isolation and places it within a recurring human story. It tells us that collapse is rarely about a single villain or a lone catastrophe. It is about a system losing its ability to solve the problems it faces until the cost of maintaining the status quo becomes unbearable. The sea peoples, the drought, the earthquakes, these were the triggers, but the vulnerability was built into the very structure of that glittering age. Understanding this pattern does not diminish the tragedy, but it illuminates a sobering truth about the life cycles of civilizations. It invites us to look at the intricate, interconnected systems of our own world and ask, where are the points of greatest strain, and what are the true costs of maintaining our own magnificent complexity? The shadow of the sea people stretches far beyond ancient ruins into the glowing screens of our own time. In popular video games, they are often the ultimate late-game crisis, a mysterious red wave of ships that spawns from the fog of war to shatter established empires. Documentaries seeking a compelling villain sometimes frame them with ominous music and talk of a dark age brought by ruthless invaders. These portrayals are undeniably gripping, but they often recycle a 3,000-year-old narrative, one crafted by the pharaohs themselves. In this modern retelling, the sea peoples become a monolithic, faceless force, a convenient symbol of chaos that simplifies a deeply complicated historical tragedy. This persistent image reveals less about the Bronze Age and more about how we, as a culture, prefer our history, with clear villains and straightforward tales of conquest. Unraveling these modern myths is not just academic, it is a crucial step in seeing the past with clearer eyes. The most common misconception is the idea of the sea peoples as a distinct race or a unified nation descending with a single purpose. This view turns a diverse collection of displaced communities into a fantasy archetype, the barbarian horde. It ignores the compelling evidence that these groups had different origins, from Anatolian coastlines to Aegean islands, and likely different immediate goals, from finding new farmland to securing a stretch of coastline. They were a coalition of circumstance, not a civilization. Another pervasive myth is that they appeared from nowhere, a deus ex machina of history. This notion of a mysterious origin feeds the allure but contradicts everything we understand about human movement. People do not materialize on the open sea, they are pushed and pulled by tangible forces, drought, famine, and the collapse of political order. Their power was not supernatural, it was born from desperation and skill in a world coming apart. Why does the simplistic invasion narrative hold such power over us? It provides a satisfying story structure. A complex, multi-causal collapse involving climate shifts, trade breakdowns, and social unrest is messy and psychologically uncomfortable. It lacks a clear antagonist, but a shadowy armada of destroyers offers a clean, dramatic explanation, an external enemy we can visualize and blame. This narrative also subtly reinforces a timeless us versus them mentality, where civilization is always fragile and perpetually threatened by outsiders. It is a story that has been told for millennia, from the walls of Medinet Habu to the latest historical strategy game. Recognizing this pattern allows us to step back and ask, whose story are we actually hearing? Are we viewing events through the eyes of the centralized powers that fell? Or are we considering the experiences of the countless individuals, farmers, sailors, and artisans caught in the storm? Moving beyond these myths does not make the story of the Bronze Age collapse less interesting. It makes it profoundly more human and more relevant. When we let go of the faceless horde, we can see the real people, communities who lost their homes to drought, warriors whose kingdoms vanished behind them, families traveling in ox carts seeking any place of safety. Their actions were destructive, but their motivations were likely rooted in survival, not mindless annihilation. This reframing challenges us to empathize with the upheaval from all sides, to understand collapse not as a battle between good and evil, but as a systemic failure where everyone suffers and everyone adapts. The lesson shifts from beware the outsider to understand the fragility of interconnected systems. By correcting these modern misconceptions, we do not dismiss the Sea Peoples. We finally begin to see them not as phantoms of a dark age, but as human beings navigating the end of their world. When the words stopped, the pots began to speak. In the silent centuries that followed the Great Collapse, history did not vanish. It simply changed its medium. Without royal inscriptions or palace inventories to guide us, archaeologists must become detectives of the everyday, and their most abundant clue is broken pottery. These humble fragments, often dismissed as rubble, carry within their clay the cultural fingerprints of an entire age. Their shape, their decoration, and even the way their clay was prepared can tell us who made them, what they valued, and where they moved. In the wake of the chaos, one particular style of pottery becomes a ghostly tracer, illuminating the paths of the displaced. It is called Mycenaean IC1b, and its journey is a map of the post-collapse world. This pottery did not belong to the Mycenaean palaces in their prime. It emerged in the period of their disintegration, a simpler, more utilitarian version of earlier, finer wares. Its significance lies not in its beauty, but in its distribution. After the fires cooled in Greece, this very same style of pottery began appearing, not as rare imports, but as common household ware, in two critical locations far to the east. The first is the island of Cyprus. The second is the southern coast of Canaan, in the very cities that would become the land of the Philistines. Finding such pottery there poses a fascinating puzzle. Was it brought by Aegean refugees who carried their potters with them? Was it traded by surviving merchants? Or was it a conscious imitation by new ruling elites, a way of signaling a powerful foreign identity to legitimize their rule over a conquered land? The evidence in the Philistine cities is particularly telling. In the earliest settlement layers of Ashkelon or Ashdod, this Aegean-style pottery dominates. Archaeologists find cooking pots, storage jars, and drinking bowls made in a way utterly foreign to the local Canaanite tradition. The clay itself is different, often mixed with crushed shell or sand in a technique common in the Aegean. The shapes are those a Mycenaean housewife would have recognized, and the decoration uses patterns like spirals and stylized birds that echoed a world now lost. This was not a case of a few luxury items traded between elites. This was the material culture of daily life, transplanted. It strongly suggests that the people who used these pots were not just trading partners, but were themselves from, or deeply influenced by, the shattered Aegean world. They brought their culinary habits, their domestic rituals, and their aesthetic sense with them, embedded in the clay of their kitchenware. As decades turned into centuries, this pottery tells a second story, one of gradual blending. The stark Aegean style did not remain pure. Slowly, local Canaanite influences began to seep in. New shapes appeared, hybrid designs emerged, and eventually, the distinct Philistine pottery evolved into something unique, a fusion of its Aegean roots and its Levantine environment. This stylistic evolution mirrors the broader social story. The initial settlers, perhaps clinging to a familiar identity in a new land, gradually adapted, adopting local languages, gods, and customs. The pottery shards chart this cultural negotiation, this slow, generation-by-generation process of becoming something new. They show that identity after a collapse is not static. It is a conversation between memory and necessity. Meanwhile, back in the homeland, the story told by pottery is one of profound rupture. In Greece, the sophisticated pottery styles of the palatial era, with their intricate scenes of chariots and octopuses, ceased to be produced. The knowledge, the demand, and the centralized workshops that created them were gone. The pottery that followed was dramatically simpler, cruder, and far less decorated. This decline in technical skill and artistic ambition is a direct reflection of the simplification of society itself. The complex economic system that supported specialist artisans had evaporated. The broken pots in the soil of Mycenae are not just trash, they are the physical signature of a cultural amnesia, a silent testament to how much was lost when the palaces fell. So these ceramic fragments, these silent witnesses, do more than just trace migration. They become a proxy language for an age without writing. They tell us where people went, how they adapted, and how new cultural identities were forged from the ashes of the old. A cooking pot in Ashkelon whispers of a family carrying the tastes of a lost homeland. A storage jar in Cyprus speaks of a community trying to rebuild a familiar way of life. A crudely made bowl in a Greek village tells of a world reduced to its most basic needs. In their collective, broken testimony, they map the slow, painful reknitting of human connections across a scarred landscape, one careful, handmade vessel at a time. The tools of war they carried tell a story of their own. On the walls of Medinet Habu, the weapons of the sea peoples are carved with startling clarity, a frozen armory from a lost age. We see warriors wielding long thrusting spears and large, round shields that could cover most of the body, but the most telling details are in their blades and their helmets. Some carry a distinctive type of sword, one that scholars call the Nor-2. This was not a ceremonial weapon. It was a brutal, efficient tool designed for both slashing and stabbing, with a strong hilt and a blade that flared toward the tip. Its origin story is particularly revealing. This sword design did not emerge in the workshops of Egypt or the Hittite Empire. It first appears in Central Europe, and its presence in the hands of these Eastern Mediterranean fighters signals something profound. In the turbulent centuries leading up to the collapse, ideas and technologies of war were traveling across vast distances, carried along trade routes that were now humming with a different, more violent energy. The appearance of this Central European sword in an Egyptian relief hints at a world where conflict was pulling far-flung regions into a single, grim conversation. Then there are the helmets. The Sherden warriors are depicted wearing headgear crowned with a circle of horns or a disc flanked by two curved projections. This is no artistic invention. Centuries later, on the island of Sardinia, small bronze figurines of warriors were cast wearing helmets with strikingly similar horned crests. This visual echo across time and space is a powerful clue, suggesting a tangible link between this named group and the Western Mediterranean. But what does this assembled arsenal truly tell us about who they were? The equipment shows a mix of influences. The round shields and some spear types would have been familiar in the Aegean world. The Nor-2 sword points north and west. This eclectic blend supports the idea that the Sea Peoples were not a uniform army issued standard gear from a single royal armory. Instead, they were a composite force, a coalition where different groups brought their own traditional weapons and fighting styles to the alliance. Their gear suggests they were professional fighters, likely experienced warriors or mercenaries who had seen conflict before the Great Migrations began. They were not a disorganized mob, but a militarily capable confederation, adept at both land and sea combat. The reliefs show them fighting from their distinctive ships, but also battling on land, with their families and belongings following in ox-drawn carts. This was not a raiding party, it was a people on the move, and their warriors were protecting a migrating community. This level of organization indicates that while their movement may have been born from desperation, its execution required significant martial skill and coordination. The weaponry of the Late Bronze Age itself was in a state of rapid evolution, an arms race driven by the very pressures that would lead to collapse. The old paradigm of the chariot-born aristocrat, the pinnacle of Mycenaean and Hittite warfare, was being challenged. Infantry, equipped with larger shields and improved swords like the Nor-2, were becoming more effective. The appearance of these new weapons in the hands of the Sea Peoples suggests they were participants in and beneficiaries of this military innovation. They may have served as mercenaries in the armies of the great powers, learning the latest tactics and acquiring the best available arms before circumstances turned them against the very system that employed them. Their equipment, therefore, is a mirror to a world in crisis. It reflects the long-distance connections of the age, the professionalization of warfare, and the diffusion of technology that ultimately empowered those on the margins. When they finally sailed toward the wealthy coasts, they did not come as primitive barbarians with inferior arms. They came equipped with some of the most advanced military technology of the day, a stark symbol that the means of destruction had escaped the control of the palaces and now threatened to consume them. Yet in the midst of this universal ruin, one great power did not fall. Egypt survived. Its survival was not a matter of luck, but a testament to specific, powerful advantages that insulated it from the worst of the storm. The first and most fundamental shield was geography. While the empires of Anatolia and the Aegean were land-based and interconnected, Egypt was a fortress of isolation. To the east and west lay vast, impassable deserts, natural barriers that no migrating army could easily cross with families and ox carts. To the north was the sea, which could bring ships, but also gave Egyptian defenders a clear line to hold. Most importantly, at the heart of it all was the Nile. Its annual, predictable flood renewed the soil with miraculous consistency. While Hittite farmers prayed for rain that never came, Egyptian farmers could rely on the river's gift. This guaranteed agricultural surplus meant that even in hard times, Egypt's granaries were less likely to be completely empty, providing a buffer against famine that other civilizations simply did not have. A stable food supply kept the social order from fracturing at its base. The second shield was ideological. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was a living god, the sole intermediary between the people and the divine order of the universe, known as Mot. This powerful central ideology allowed for an incredible mobilization of resources in a crisis. When Ramesses III faced the combined land and sea invasion, he could command the entire nation's labor and wealth for defense. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show not just a battle, but a national project, with the pharaoh directing the construction of a defensive line in the Nile Delta and marshalling every available ship. This ability to act decisively and centrally was a luxury that fragmented kingdoms like the Hittites could no longer afford. Egypt also had the advantage of experience. Decades before the Great Invasion under Ramesses III, his predecessor Merneptah had already fought and repelled a similar coalition. That earlier victory provided a brutal lesson and a proven playbook. The Egyptian military had seen these kinds of enemies before, understood their tactics, and knew they could be beaten. This institutional memory, this lack of total surprise, was a critical edge in a world where most states were encountering the crisis for the first and last time. Yet to call Egypt a true victor would be a profound mistake. Survival came at a terrible cost, and it marked the end of an era. The glorious new kingdom, the age of empire builders like Thutmose III and Ramesses II, was over. The battle to repel the Sea Peoples drained the treasury and exhausted the state. In the aftermath, Egypt lost its valuable territories in Canaan and Syria, cutting off a major source of tribute and trade. The central government's authority slowly withered. Most tellingly, the priesthood of the god Ammon at Thebes amassed such wealth and political power that they effectively became a rival to the pharaoh himself, fracturing national unity. The pharaohs who followed ruled a diminished, inward-looking nation, more concerned with temple rituals than foreign conquest. Egypt did not collapse, but it contracted, retreating from the world stage for centuries. Its resilience highlights a crucial lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. Geographic luck and strong, centralized institutions could mediate the impact of a systemic crisis, acting as a buffer against the tide. But no civilization, no matter how favored, emerged from that century of chaos unchanged or unscathed. Egypt's story is not one of triumph, but of costly endurance, a civilization that saved its body but lost its empire, forever scarred by the same storm that obliterated its rivals. The old world had been swept away, but the land was not left empty. From the ashes of the centralized palaces, new political forms began to take root, smaller, more resilient, and ultimately more dynamic. The collapse of the great empires had shattered the top-heavy superstructure of the Bronze Age, and in the power vacuum that followed, a different kind of society could emerge. This was not a quick rebirth, but a slow, often difficult regrowth from the ground up, leading to the world we now call the Iron Age. Instead of vast territories ruled from a single, fortified capital, the political map was now dotted with smaller, fiercely independent units. Along the coast of the Levant, the Phoenician city-states of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos rose to prominence. They were not agricultural empires but mercantile hubs, inheriting and revitalizing the shattered trade networks of their Canaanite predecessors. Freed from the heavy hand of Egyptian or Hittite overlords, they turned their gaze westward, pioneering maritime exploration that would eventually take them beyond the Mediterranean. Their greatest legacy, however, was not in goods but in letters. In the wake of the collapse, they perfected and spread the alphabet, a writing system so simple and efficient it could be learned in days rather than the years required for cuneiform or hieroglyphs. This was a democratization of knowledge, a tool that would eventually empower merchants, poets, and philosophers, not just palace scribes. Inland, new ethnic and tribal kingdoms consolidated their identity. The Arameans established powerful city-states in Syria, and their language became the lingua franca of trade and diplomacy across the Near East for centuries. Further south, the scattered tribes of the Israelites gradually coalesced into kingdoms, their stories of exodus and covenant forming a powerful new narrative of identity, rooted not in a palace, but in a shared faith and law. This shift from imperial to ethnic identity was a direct consequence of the old universal order falling apart. People now defined themselves by their language, their god, and their local ruler, not by their tribute to a distant great king. In Greece, the long silence of the Dark Age was finally broken. The scattered, impoverished villages slowly began to reconnect. Out of this slow recovery emerged the polis, the independent city-state, a community defined by the participation of its citizens. Places like Athens and Sparta, though often at odds, represented a radical new model of social organization, one where power, however imperfectly, was debated in an agora rather than decreed from a throne room. This political innovation was arguably made possible because the memory of a single, all-powerful Mycenaean wanax or king had faded into myth. The material foundation of this new age was, of course, iron. The collapse of the long-distance tin trade had made bronze, the signature metal of the prior era, prohibitively difficult to produce on a large scale. Iron, by contrast, was relatively common. Its ore could be found in many more places, and while the process of smelting it was technically challenging, it did not require coordinating a supply chain across continents. This accessibility was revolutionary. Iron tools made farming more efficient for the common person, and iron weapons, though initially no better than bronze, could be produced locally, reducing dependence on a fragile international system. The decentralization of metal production mirrored the decentralization of power itself. No single palace controlled the supply, which meant military and economic capability was more widely distributed. The simplified alphabet and the accessible technology of iron worked in tandem, enabling a world where innovation and expression could flourish in many centers, not just a few. The Great Catastrophe, therefore, was also a great filter. It eliminated a system that had become too rigid and too complex to sustain itself. In its painful wake, it created the space for smaller, more agile, and more diverse societies to experiment. The classical civilizations of Greece, Phoenicia, and Israel were not direct descendants of the Bronze Age palaces. They were their successors, shaped in the crucible of that collapse. They carried forward fragments of the old world, but they built something fundamentally new upon its ruins, a world where the voice of the citizen, the merchant, and the prophet would begin to echo as loudly as the edict of the king. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not a solved case but an ongoing investigation. Despite decades of meticulous research, fundamental questions remain fiercely contested, their answers shifting like sand with each new discovery. Historians and archaeologists still debate the exact sequence of the catastrophe. Did the drought trigger the migrations, or did the migrations disrupt agriculture and cause famine? Were the palaces burning from the outside in or from the inside out? The evidence points to a tangled knot of causes, but untangling the precise order of events is a challenge that may never be fully resolved. This leads directly to the central, heated debate about the sea peoples themselves. Were they the primary cause of the collapse, a conquering horde that delivered the killing blow to weakened empires? Or were they merely a secondary symptom, a dramatic effect of a system already in terminal failure? Your answer to this question shapes your entire understanding of the period, and scholars remain divided, with compelling evidence on both sides. The mystery of their origins is equally persistent. We have names from Egyptian inscriptions and possible cultural links from archaeology, but pinning each group to a specific homeland on a map is an exercise in educated guesswork. Were the Peleset from the Aegean, or were they a coalition from several regions? Did the Sherden truly have roots in Sardinia, or is the similarity in names just a coincidence? New discoveries constantly fuel these debates. Recent excavations in Cilicia, in southern Turkey, have uncovered fortified sites from this era that some researchers suggest could be settlements or strongholds used by these very groups. Even more revolutionary are advances in ancient DNA analysis. Genetic studies of remains from sites across the eastern Mediterranean promise to trace movements of people, not just parts. Yet these scientific tools bring new controversies. How do we interpret genetic shifts? Do they represent conquest, peaceful migration, or the slow blending of populations? Each new piece of evidence is a clue, but it is also a piece of a larger, more complex puzzle we are still assembling. On the ground, the pattern of destruction itself is puzzling. Why did mighty Hattusa burn and lie abandoned for centuries, while a city like Inkomi on Cyprus was damaged but then rebuilt with a new cultural identity? Why were some centers violently sacked, while others appear to have been peacefully left to decay? These variations tell us the collapse was not a uniform event. Local conditions, leadership, geography, and sheer luck played enormous roles in determining a city's fate. It reminds us that history is not a single narrative, but millions of individual stories converging in a moment of crisis. Perhaps the most important realization is that the very term we use, sea peoples, is a modern label. It is a convenient shorthand we have created to describe a phenomenon that the ancient Egyptians, Hittites, and others likely did not perceive as a single, unified entity. To an Egyptian scribe, they were the foreign countries of the sea, a collective term for a terrifying, chaotic threat. To a displaced farmer from Anatolia joining their ranks, they were simply a chance for survival. Embracing this uncertainty is not a failure of history, but its very essence. The gaps in our knowledge, the competing theories, the unanswered questions, these are not flaws in the record. They are an open invitation. They pull us into the mystery, asking us to weigh the evidence, to imagine the possibilities, and to understand that the past is not a static monument. but a living conversation that continues with every fragment unearthed and every old text read in a new light. The search for truth no longer rests in a single field of study. To truly understand the collapse, we must listen to a whole chorus of sciences, each adding its unique voice to an ancient story. This is where the modern investigation becomes a thrilling collaboration, a fusion of disciplines that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. While archaeologists continue their careful work with trowel and brush, unearthing the physical layers of destruction, other scientists are examining layers of a different kind. Climatologists drill deep into lake beds and analyze the slow drip of stalagmites in caves, reading the chemical signatures of ancient droughts preserved in stone and sediment. Their work provides the essential environmental backdrop, the hard data on the changing sky that set the stage for human drama. Meanwhile, geneticists are performing a kind of molecular archaeology. By extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from skeletal remains found across the Mediterranean, they can trace the movements of people, not just pottery. This technology offers a potential breakthrough, allowing us to see if the population of a city changed after its destruction, or if individuals buried in a battlefield came from faraway lands. Each skeleton becomes a passport, its genetic code holding clues to a lifetime's journey. Linguists, too, play a crucial role in this interdisciplinary puzzle. They meticulously analyze the names of the sea peoples recorded by the Egyptians, searching for roots in known languages, tracing phonetic echoes across centuries to suggest possible homelands. Is the name Denyen connected to the Danaoi of Greek legend? Does Jekka relate to the Teucrians of the Troad? These are not just academic exercises, they are attempts to recover lost identities from mere syllables. Out on the waves, maritime archaeologists scan the seabed with sonar and remote vehicles, hoping to find the one discovery that has so far eluded us, a shipwreck that can be definitively linked to these seaborne raiders. Such a find would be a time capsule, revealing not just their vessel's construction, but its cargo, its tools, and the everyday life of its crew. This collaborative model is revolutionizing our understanding, moving us beyond the biased accounts of ancient victors. For a powerful example, consider the science of isotopic analysis. The food and water we consume in our childhood leave a distinct chemical signature in our teeth, a permanent record of our geographic origins. Scientists can now take a tiny sample from an ancient tooth and determine where that individual likely grew up. Imagine applying this to remains found in the destruction layer of a sacked city. If we found warriors with isotopic signatures pointing to the Aegean or Anatolia, buried amidst the ruins of a Canaanite palace, it would provide stunning physical proof of foreign fighters present at the moment of collapse. This turns a historical hypothesis into a scientific fact. The picture emerging from this holistic approach is incredibly rich, but it is also far more complicated than any simple invasion narrative. It shows a 12th century before the Common Era defined by intersecting crises, where climate shifts pushed populations, where economic failure sparked conflict, and where diverse groups of people coalesced and moved in a desperate search for stability. Each scientific discipline adds a new layer of resolution, revealing nuances and exceptions to every rule. What this truly demonstrates is that history itself is a science, constantly evolving with new tools. Our story of the past is not fixed. It is a living narrative refined with every core sample drilled, every genome sequenced, and every syllable deciphered. The mystery of the Bronze Age collapse is being solved not by a lone scholar in a library, but by a global team of detectives reading the earth, the bones, and the water, slowly assembling a truth that is as multifaceted as the human experience itself. Behind every fallen empire are countless untold stories. The grand theories of climate change and systemic failure map the scale of the disaster, but to feel its true weight, we must step down from the global map and into the dusty streets of a city in its final hours. History becomes most real not in the analysis of pollen cores, but in the intimate, frozen moments of individual lives caught in the storm. We know the name Ugarit fell from history, but we can almost hear the panic in its scribbled quarter. Picture a young administrator, his fingers smudged with damp clay, etching a frantic plea for help onto a tablet. The message states enemy ships have already been sighted, a fact that makes the very act of writing it an act of desperate hope. He places the tablet in the oven to harden, a routine step, but this time the firing is never completed. The kiln cools, abandoned with the plea still inside. That unfinished tablet, discovered millennia later, is not just an artifact, it is a suspended moment of human fear, a voice interrupted mid-sentence by a catastrophe that arrived faster than a warning could be sent. Elsewhere, the evidence is even more visceral. In a cellar of a burning city, perhaps somewhere in the Levant, a family huddles together. They have brought their most precious possessions, some jewelry, a few heirloom pots, their small store of grain. The ceiling timbers above them groan, and the air fills with smoke. They do not emerge. Centuries later, archaeologists find their resting place, a silent testament to the most personal kind of loss, a family unit extinguished in a single, terrible moment. Their story has no names, no recorded deeds, yet it speaks more powerfully than any king's inscription about the universal human desire for shelter and survival. For every warrior on a ship, there were countless non-combatants, the elderly, the children, the artisans, whose entire world was reduced to the simple imperative of finding tomorrow. Contrast this with the poignant story of the Griffin warrior, buried at Pylos in Greece on the very eve of the collapse. His tomb was a capsule of a world about to vanish. He was laid to rest with astonishing wealth, a bronze sword with a gold and ivory hilt, intricate seals, and strands of precious beads. These objects were symbols of his elite status, a language of power and prestige that everyone in his society understood. Yet within a generation, that language would become gibberish. The system that gave those treasures their meaning, the palace that commissioned them, the social order that honored them, would be ash. The warrior's magnificent grave goods, intended to proclaim his glory for eternity, instead became a museum of a lost culture, their significance buried with the world that created them. Then there are the stories of those who fled. Along ancient coastlines, we find evidence of hurried abandonment, not violent destruction. A cooking pot left by a doorway, a loom weight dropped in a courtyard, a child's toy forgotten in the corner. These are the artifacts of flight, of people who gathered what they could carry and left everything else behind, casting off onto the unforgiving sea toward an unknown horizon. The courage required for that decision is staggering, to choose the peril of the open water over the certain doom of a besieged home. Each of those fragile vessels carried its own epic of fear and hope, a microcosm of the entire age's displacement. These fragments, the unfired letter, the family in the cellar, the opulent tomb, the abandoned toy, they anchor the monumental narrative of collapse in tangible human experience. They remind us that the late Bronze Age collapse was not an abstract historical transition. It was a profound tragedy lived by millions of individuals. It was the end of countless personal worlds, the silencing of dreams, the severing of lineages, and the erasure of futures. For every theory about drought and trade routes, there is a corresponding human reality of thirst, hunger, and desperate journeys. This dimension forces a shift in perspective. We move from analyzing why civilizations fall to empathizing with what it feels like to live through that fall. The voices of these individuals are mostly lost to time, but the objects they left behind, touched by their hands and charged with their intentions, allow them a whisper of presence across the millennia. Their stories of fear, resilience, and heartbreaking loss ensure we remember that history's great turning points are never merely about systems and empires, but always fundamentally about people. The echoes of those personal tragedies across 3 millennia are not just historical whispers, they are a resonant warning for our own age. The parallels between their interconnected world and our globalized one are too striking to ignore. Just as the Hittite king depended on tin from Afghanistan, our smartphones rely on rare earth minerals from specific corners of the globe. Their palace economies were centralized hubs controlling food and wealth, not unlike our modern, just-in-time supply chains and financial networks, where a disruption in one port or a failure in one bank can ripple out to paralyze continents. The Bronze Age superpowers believed their system was permanent, a divine order, much as we often assume the stability of our modern institutions is a given. Their story shatters that illusion. It demonstrates with brutal clarity that complexity and interconnectedness, while sources of immense strength, also create profound vulnerability. A system that is highly efficient is often highly fragile, optimized for growth under stable conditions but brittle when those conditions change. The drought that crippled their agriculture finds its modern counterpart in the escalating climate disruptions that threaten our own food security and water supplies, reminding us that environmental stability is the non-negotiable foundation upon which all civilization is built. The political fragmentation and loss of trust that preceded their collapse mirrors the rising political polarization and erosion of international cooperation we see today, where shared challenges are met with division rather than unified action. The lesson is not that collapse is inevitable for us, but that the conditions which make it possible are alarmingly familiar. Their experience teaches the critical difference between interdependence and resilience. Interconnection alone is a network of pathways. Resilience is the system's ability to absorb a shock, to adapt, and to keep functioning. The Bronze Age world had deep interdependence but shallow resilience. When the pathways were cut, the entire system failed. For us, building resilience might mean diversifying supply chains, investing in local food security, designing decentralized energy grids, and fostering social cohesion that can withstand hardship. Most importantly, their collapse is a profound lesson in humility. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that no civilization, no matter how technologically sophisticated or culturally dominant, possesses a guarantee of permanence. The Egyptians, Hittites, and Mycenaeans were not primitive. They were the pinnacle of human achievement for their time. Their monuments were meant to last forever, and yet they fell. This is not a call for fear, but for clear-eyed awareness. Studying this ancient catastrophe is ultimately an act of foresight. By understanding how one world ended, we gain the tools to think more carefully about how to sustain our own. It shifts our focus from short-term growth to long-term adaptability, from exploiting efficiency to engineering robustness. The ghosts of the sea peoples and the kings who fought them ask us a single, urgent question. In our own brilliant, interconnected, and increasingly stressed world, what are we doing today to weave threads that are not just strong, but flexible enough to bend without breaking when the next great storm arrives? The final answer lies not in a single cause, but in a perfect storm of failures. To solve the mystery of the sea peoples, we must stop looking for a lone villain and instead see the entire stage collapsing around every actor. This was a systems collapse, a term that captures the terrifying synergy of multiple crises. Imagine a row of dominoes, but not in a straight line. Instead, they are arranged in a complex, interlocking web. Knock one over, and the entire structure unravels in a cascade that seems both chaotic and inevitable. The first domino was the climate. A prolonged mega-drought did not just cause a few bad harvests, it systematically dismantled the agricultural foundation of every kingdom from Greece to Babylon. Famine followed, weakening populations and setting entire communities adrift in search of food and safety. These climate refugees were the first wave of human movement, pressing against borders and straining resources. This environmental shock then toppled the next critical domino, the economy. The intricate, long-distance trade networks that supplied tin for bronze and luxuries for royal gift-giving were brittle. As famine sparked local conflicts and insecurity, those trade routes snapped. Ships stopped sailing, and the palace workshops fell silent. Kings who could no longer equip their armies or reward their allies saw their prestige and power evaporate overnight. The economic collapse eroded the very legitimacy of the state. With empty granaries and silent ports, the sacred contract between ruler and ruled shattered. This is where the third domino fell: social and political cohesion. A hungry population, taxed heavily by a palace that could no longer protect or provide, is a population ripe for unrest. Internal rebellions, factional coups, and a general loss of faith in the old order became likely, even probable. The great walls of Mycenae and Hattusa were now as much defenses against internal despair as against external foes. The centralized, hyper-complex palace systems had become liabilities. They required constant inflows of wealth and grain to sustain their bureaucracies, their armies, and their monumental projects. When those inflows stopped, the systems had no way to downsize or adapt. They were engineered for growth and stability, not for resilience or retreat. This created a vast and terrifying power vacuum across the eastern Mediterranean, and nature, like history, abhors a vacuum. Into this void surged the mixed forces we call the Sea Peoples. They were not a cause but a consequence, a human manifestation of the chaos. Their confederation likely included displaced Anatolian farmers, unemployed Mycenaean sailors, mercenaries from the fringes of fallen empires, and perhaps ambitious groups from the western Mediterranean drawn toward the dissolving center of wealth. They were raiders, refugees, and opportunists, all riding the same wave of systemic failure. Their attacks were not the first strike against a healthy world. They were the final, accelerating blows against a patient already in multiple organ failure. They exploited the military vulnerability created by bankrupt treasuries and distracted armies. They sacked cities that were already starving and divided. In doing so, they became the most visible and dramatic face of the catastrophe, their name etched forever as the bringers of the Dark Age. Therefore, the true identity of the Sea Peoples cannot be separated from the collapsing world they inhabited. They were not a foreign infection, but a symptom of the fever. Their story is the story of what happens when a highly interconnected, highly specialized civilization loses its fundamental buffers, when environmental stability, economic continuity, and political legitimacy all fail in concert. They were the whirlwind reaped from a perfect storm of sown vulnerabilities. This synthesis does not simplify the mystery, it deepens it, transforming an ancient whodunit into a timeless case study in the fragility of human complexity. Our journey ends not with a solved mystery, but with a deeper appreciation for the questions themselves. The twilight of the Bronze Age reveals a story where the line between cause and effect, between victim and aggressor, is beautifully and tragically blurred. We have searched for the Sea Peoples only to find they are not a single people waiting to be discovered in a tomb or on a map. They are a symbol, a name we have given to the chaotic human turbulence that fills a power vacuum. They were the desperate farmers pushed from parched fields, the sailors whose trade routes vanished, the warriors whose kings had fallen. In their movement, we see not mindless destruction, but a heartbreaking struggle for survival in a world that was coming apart at the seams. The collapse of those glittering superpowers stands as one of history's most sobering lessons, written not in triumphant stone, but in layers of ash and profound silence. It reminds us that no civilization, no matter how brilliant or seemingly permanent, is immune to the converging pressures of a changing climate, a faltering economy, and a loss of shared purpose. Their interconnected world, so like our own, possessed a stunning efficiency that masked a fatal fragility. Yet if this were only a story of loss, it would be incomplete. From the profound darkness of that age emerged the seeds of the world we recognize. In the simplified, localized societies that slowly regrew, we find the origins of the alphabet, a tool of astonishing democratization. We see the rise of new nations and identities, from the Phoenician traders to the Greek city-states, whose experiments in politics and philosophy would shape millennia. The painful simplification forced by the collapse cleared the ground for new, more resilient forms of human organization to take root. The mystery of the Sea Peoples and the fall of the Bronze Age, therefore, endures. It endures not as a failure of history, but as its very essence. It is an ongoing conversation between the past and our present, a dialogue that continues with every climate datum analyzed, every ancient genome sequenced, and every broken potsherd examined. It asks us to look at the intricate systems of our own world and consider the true meaning of resilience. If this exploration has shifted your view of ancient history, of what it means for an age to end and a new one to begin, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and join us as we continue to unravel the deepest mysteries of our shared human past, one story at a time.